The NFL regular season is officially over and the NFL playoffs are upon us. So naturally, the question on everybody's mind is who is going to make the Super Bowl and who will eventually win it? Well, using statistics from the last 23 Super Bowls, I have narrowed down the two teams that will play in the Super Bowl, and I'm going to let you know the justification shortly. As always, if you like the video, give it a thumbs up. Let me know in the comment section what you think and who you're taking. And especially if you're using this video to help you, please subscribe to the channel. It means a lot. So the stats that I'll be looking at are from ESPN, public stats that everyone can look at, taking a look at offensive and defensive stats from the regular season to try to predict the Super Bowl winner. We're looking at total yards offensively, total points per game offensively, total yards allowed defensively, and total points per game allowed defensively. And between these four statistics, not only can we make a very informed decision on who's going to win the Super Bowl or make the Super Bowl, but actually we can get extremely precise and pick the two teams that we think are going to represent the AFC and NFC. Taking a look at some high-level stats here from the four metrics that we're looking, again, offensive and defensive yards per game and offensive and defensive points per game. Obviously, from the highest, you're going to get a first-place Super Bowl winner in any of these statistics. But what you want to look at to make some better informed decisions is what's the average for these statistics. You know, on average, the Super Bowl winner is a top 10 offensive points per game and top 10 defensive points per game team, and they're right outside the top 10 for yards defensively and offensively. And even more importantly, perhaps, is the lowest. We have not seen a Super Bowl champion in the past 23 years since 2000 that has been worse than 20th in offensive points per game defensively, or have had a terrible defense and let up the 25th worst defensive points per game. So use these lowest stats in mind to rule out some of the teams that fall outside this criteria. Just thinking off the cuff, the Buccaneers are probably not the team that's going to win the Super Bowl because they're not putting up points in a best 2/3% in the NFL. So something to keep in mind there. Breaking it down even further, we're looking at these stats from how many teams are finishing within the top 10 within the metrics. What about the top 5? What about top 5 in both or top 10 in both? Taking a look at that, I think we can get a better idea who's going to win. I'm going to break this down into better palatable sizes. So let's start with the top 10 finish column. If we look at that, the metric that is most damning to try to choose a Super Bowl champion is the top 10 finish in offensive points per game. 75% of the time, 3/4 of the time, the Super Bowl representative will have finished within the top 10 in offensive points per game within the regular season. Moving forward to the next column at top 5, half the time those teams are also in the top 5 or a team is in the top 5 for defensive points per game. So even more importantly than offensive points per game finishing in the top 5 in the regular season, it's even more important and more prevalent for the Super Bowl to be a top 5 defensive team in terms of points per game. Looking at top 10 in both, 11 times, half the time since the turn of the century, teams that made the Super Bowl and won the Super Bowl were top 10 in both offensive points per game and defensive points per game. Narrowing that down, skipping the top 5 in both, top 5 in either. 80% of the time, 4 out of 5 times, the teams that win the Super Bowl are top 5 in either offensive or defensive points per game. That is a huge percentage of the teams. So do not bet on a team this Super Bowl unless you're trying to pick an extreme outlier. Do not pick a team that is not top 5 in either offensive points per game or defensive points per game. And I skipped this last column strategically. Look at this top 5 in both. It's very rare that a team that wins Super Bowl is top 5 in both offensive and defensive points per game. It doesn't happen that often. It's only happened 3 times that the Super Bowl winner was top 5 in both. But every single time that a team is top 5 in both offensive points per game and defensive points per game, that team makes the Super Bowl. They might not win it, but that team makes the Super Bowl. And knowing that, you should put a lot of weight if you see a team this season that is in top 5 points per game offensively and top 5 points per game defensively. So let's look at all the teams that make the playoffs and try to decide where we're going to land here. You can see that some of these teams are very spread out across the spectrum, like the Browns, who are an incredible team defensively, especially in terms of yards, but have struggled offensively. The Steelers are terrible offensively, but they're in the playoffs because of the fact that they are the 5th best team in terms of points per game. Going back to that stat that I mentioned earlier, you want to look at offensive points per game and defensive points per game because, again, the teams aren't going to make the Super Bowl unless they're top 5 in one of them. So here, every team is, or sorry, top 10 in one of them. So here, every team is at least falls within the top 10 in one of these two metrics. But what's even more important is the final stat that I mentioned. The Ravens are top 5 in both offensive and defensive points per game. And if history proves anything, it says that the Ravens will be representing the AFC in the Super Bowl. Taking a look at the NFC here, again, your team that picked Super Bowl really does need to be within the top 10 in some metric. So the Packers, who looked really good and are the 7th seed and playing really well as of late, and Jordan Love looks great, they're not top 10 in either metric. So history says they're not going to do it. And again, look at the 49ers, the 1 seed in the NFC. They are top 5 in both offensive and defensive points per game. That is incredibly important. Like I mentioned, again, it has not happened where a team that's top 5 offensively and defensively has missed the Super Bowl. It just so happens that there are 2 teams that have done it this year. Again, only 3 teams have ever done this in the last 23 years since the turn of the century. We have 2 teams this year. So knowing that, it seems like the pick has to be the Niners versus the Ravens in the Super Bowl. It is incredibly easy to say that because they're both number 1 seeds, but it has been so rare that we see 2 teams that are dominating on both sides of the football the way that these 2 teams have. So these 2 teams have played once this season. The Ravens won by double digits and looked very good. And that was in Santa Clara playing at San Francisco. So that's even more impressive. This game, if it were to happen, would be obviously on a neutral site. I think you have to side with the Ravens this one. Their defense and ability to put the pressure on Brock Purdy, who is not as good as the MVP Lamar Jackson, seems to be all the reason to take the Ravens here. These teams, again, are very similar, both, and I cannot reiterate this enough, they are both top 5 in both offensive and defensive points per game. So very similar in makeup, being very strong on both sides of the ball. What I like the most is the Ravens with their pedigree of their quarterback, Lamar Jackson, 1st-round pick, Brock Purdy, last pick in the draft for him. I know that stuff fades away after they play so well, but you've seen Brock Purdy against good teams, and he does not play the way that Lamar Jackson does, especially if you can get pressure on him and make him uncomfortable in the pocket. So I think with the stats, these 2 teams are all but guaranteed to play each other in the Super Bowl, and I think the Ravens will prevail. That's the video. I really think you guys should put a lot of stock into this stat. This is all but guaranteeing these 2 teams in there. It really helps if they both get the 1st round bye, but it would take a monstrous twist of fate for either of these teams to not make the Super Bowl. Best of luck in your predictions for the playoffs in 2024.